I want to start just by showing you this, website address. It's mapfling.com/QTAOPAP. That way, if you write that down, you can see the progress, because the new, as we visit cemeteries, there are 3 symbols. There are stars. That means we've actually put feet on the ground, boots on the ground, and actually visited the cemetery and positively identified through GPS coordinates where it is, which to me is the most important thing of this project, because once they're identified positively, GPS coordinated, then they can always be revisited for other information. The other marks on here are triangles. And triangles indicate that we tried to find the cemetery, but there was no obvious evidence for a cemetery. And I'll go through here what are some signs in a little bit. And then the teardrops are cemeteries that we've located through secondary sources, going through genealogies, different things like that in the county. And that's the first thing we did to try to find out as many as we could locate secondary source. And now what we're in the process of doing is proving that those cemeteries actually are there in the close proximity. Now this map doesn't look like there's around 450 cemeteries. So I'm going to pull up the actual website, and to show you what happens when you actually come out when you that's the cemetery. It looks like Culpeper, right? When you look at that, Culpeper County, and if you bring it in, you can see how many more cemeteries pop up in a certain area. And then of course you can bring this down to satellite imaging, and you can bring it literally down to see where the cemetery is on a very small parcel. But it's by following that website. And so with that, we'll get started. Just to kind of give you an idea, our largest focus is with family and private small cemeteries. We've got about 450 cemeteries that we've identified through secondary sources, and of those, 52 are public or church cemeteries, religious cemeteries. And those are things that we're really not that interested in, because they're not going to be lost to conditions. They're still being used, many of these, so those are the ones that are not under threat. What we're trying to preserve are those that are most under threat from development, that nobody knows they're there, to try to make sure that they're protected, at least they're identified. So, and you look at that, about 88.5% that we've identified as secondary sources are classified as family and private cemetery, which is pretty high. If you look at Virginia overall, they're roughly in the 75 to 80% nature that they think there are private or family cemeteries compared to in a region. So almost 90% is very heavily private cemeteries. Okay, I lost my source. Might have to go get Andrew again. We've been having a few little glitches concerning this, but I will continue and we'll go through some of this, and hopefully we can get his screen back up. I always have, and I should have brought it, my own hot projector, because it's linked pretty well with my stuff. But they had a projector here, and 90% of the time it works pretty good. It was, I don't know. But anyway, just to kind of give you a little more of a talk about the cemeteries that we visit. Towards the end, and we might maybe do this right now. Wayne, for some reason, just lost the image.
Right.
And But we find, what the process that we go through as far as finding cemeteries. We usually go to the county GIS maps, and we find out who the owners are. We look at what we're looking for. We try to do groupings because it makes it easier for us. And if you're in one area of the county, try to find 4 or 5 different cemeteries. And then we look and see if we can find the owners. And then most of the time we don't have pre-knowledge of, they don't have pre-knowledge of us coming out because we can't find often contact information from them through the GIS other than through the addresses. So we'll go and we'll knock on doors, and sometimes they're home, sometimes they aren't. If they're home and they know about the cemetery, it's always a good thing because they usually say, oh yeah, I can take you out there. And we've had a pretty good response that way. Sometimes they're not home, sometimes we look, sometimes we go to a door and we ask them if they know about the cemetery on their property, and they will tell us, I didn't know there's a cemetery on my property. And then we kind of show them where things are, and we often locate it. But that's kind of the process. Sometimes we cannot find any evidence of the cemetery. I will go through here in a second, hopefully, to tell you, show you some things that show evidences of the cemetery. But this county, it's old. Culpeper County comes out of Essex County, then it came to Spotsylvania County, and then Orange County, and then Culpeper County. And by the time you really had settlement here is when you had Governor Spotswood founded Germanna, and when Governor Spotswood did his little expedition over the mountains around 1712, that really opened up Culpeper County for settlement. Before that time, there's a lot of people that had land grants out here, but there wasn't a lot of settlement. Beginning about 1720s, we started having people come out here. And as we all know, when people are starting to settle, people are starting to die. And so our burials probably begin in that time frame, from 1720s to about 1740s. Culpeper County became a county in 1749. So that meant that there were enough people settled here to justify breaking away from Orange County. So that kind of gives you an idea how old some of these cemeteries probably are. They go back a long ways. And with that, there's a lot of burying being done. The first cemeteries that we really have as public cemeteries, as far as religious cemeteries, really didn't probably begin until the 1730s, and that's Great Fork Church. Great Fork Church is out on the historic Madden property, and that's where it existed. It was built in 1733. It was there from Reverend Thompson. It was one of the first, the second actual, the Reverend John Thompson built Salubria, just to kind of give you some reference point that you probably have along Route 3. And he's the one, that was the second one when the church really got up and going. Governor Spotswood would have attended that church for the last 7 years of his life. He and Lady Spotswood, and after his death in 1740, she would have continued to go there, and that's where obviously she met Reverend Thompson, and they later were married. And they later built Salubria, which was very close to the church. It was less than 3 miles away, so there's a reason why Salubria was there. It was very close to where he was attending religious services and preaching at. So with that, you have that church where there would have been some burials. But as far as Virginia goes historically, most people in Virginia bury their own on their own farms or plantations. That's just what we did in Virginia. And typically, if you didn't have a good burial spot or you had to be buried for some reason, you died somewhere, they might bury you in a religious place. If you were Anglican, which most before the Revolutionary War, that's where you were probably buried in Anglican Cemetery. A good example of that is Joseph Downman. Joseph Downman was buried at the Great Fork or Lower Fork Church in where I just earlier mentioned on the Madden property. His is the last surviving tomb at that property. And there's still evidence of that tomb. There's newspaper write-ups in the newspaper here locally, Culpeper, going back to the 1880s, talking about that tomb and visiting it and all of that stuff. So we know that that there was a cemetery there. I have no idea what happened. I will quickly go through this. I've already talked about. This just kind of gives you the formation of Culpeper County breaking down, and I've already mentioned about how Culpeper County quickly broke away after Orange County. They started 1740s, which meant there were burials going on. I am not talking about some of the major public and religious cemeteries that are here, especially in Culpeper County. St. Stephen's got started in the 1820s. Of course, St. Stephen's is right here, just north of Main, just north of Davis Street. You have Fairview Cemetery, got started in the 1850s, and which is out here on Route 522. And then you have Antioch Cemeteries, which was the African American section of the cemetery. Its first graves were in the 1870s. They were somewhat separated, but they were kind of a little bit overlapped into each other until the early 1900s, about 1905, when Virginia adopted their full segregation, and then those cemeteries became segregated. And then in the 1970s, they rejoined again. So it's Fairview Cemetery today. And then, of course, Culpeper National Cemetery got started in 1867. So those are 4 cemeteries. They're not threatened. We're not dealing with those. But those are some important early cemeteries. Just to kind of give you an idea what we look at, what we find. These are monuments. If you're really lucky, you find monuments and think, oh my God, I found a cemetery, because it's obvious here. Somebody's put up some headstones. That, I don't know, Wayne, 10% of the time we see that? It's pretty rare. Yeah. What we often find are field stones. And these are field stones. They're just stones in the ground. And one of the reasons for that, even the wealthy in this county didn't have a lot of money. It was hard. We didn't have, prior to 1800, 1820 even, you really didn't have expertise here, people. You had to either go to Williamsburg or go over and have monuments made in London and shipped over, or Aquia Harbor here, Aquia Stone in Stafford County. But there just weren't the skilled people around to do all this, and most people did not have the money to put out for that. So what you often find, this is what we generally look for, are field stones. And then if there's no field stones, which many cemeteries don't have field stones, we look for depressions. And this is a good picture that I took years ago showing a cemetery with depressions. Now sometimes after light snow or a heavy frost, the upper parts of the depressions melt off earlier, and you can see the cups of the depressions. So this is what it's harder to find in the daytime, especially in the summer with all the growth. But these are the 3 things that give us indications that they're there. Now I've already talked a little bit about Great Fork Cemetery. This is on the current Madden property. It's located here. This is where the Madden's, the historic tavern is located. This is Madden's Tavern Road here. So that cemetery is identified by a stone of Joseph Downman, established in the early 1730s. The church was holding services until the 1820s, sporadically. This right here, you can hardly see it, but that's the dot where the marker is of Downman's tomb. And over here, if you look at a variety of different overhead images, you see an area here that crops don't seem to grow very well. And that shows up on different images. I'm assuming that that's probably where the church was, because historic accounts say that the cemetery was just a little bit to the northeast of the church. And if you look at this, the church, the graves right over here, and this area is there. So I don't know for sure, but a lot of times there's enough foundation that the soil isn't very deep there that makes it so it's not as productive. And you can kind of see a little area there. This is what Downman's marker looks like today. It's been there since 1799. This shows up on the 1820 map. This is an account of many accounts about Downman's tomb that shows up since the 1880s in local newspapers. And of course, Joseph Ball Downman that was buried there, he's the first cousin once removed from George Washington. This is, Joseph Ball Downman is the daughter of Raleigh, or the son of Raleigh and Francis Ball Downman, who you see right here. He's this guy that's buried there. And his parents, Francis Ball, was the first cousin, first half cousin of George Washington. So it's George Washington's first half cousin once removed is who's buried in that cemetery. And the reason why he's there is because Samuel Ball was the court justice here in Orange County, and then one of the first court justices when Culpeper was born. And the Balls were starting to come out here, and Downman had a brother that had lain out here. So I'm sure he was out here trying to help his brother when he died, and he was buried in the local cemetery. Now, this is the Madden family cemetery. The Madden cemetery over here is where that star there, you can barely see, that's where the Downman, that's where the early church was. And the Madden family cemetery is just to the south across Madden Tavern Road. Large African-American cemetery there. Here's some of the Madden family members that are buried there. If you look at some of the records, there was a glebe house across the road south of where the church was. And my feeling is that there was a glebe house, and over time there was an African-American cemetery started around the glebe house. Because if you go out here, and I've been out here with Bill Madden before, and there's a lot more graves in that cemetery than are Maddens. And it appears, that's my theory, no proof to that, but I do have proof, at least through newspaper accounts, that the glebe house is over here. The glebe house is where the minister would have stayed, where they would put up the minister. To that end, the Reverend Thompson, of course this is Salubria, which isn't too far away from where we were with the Madden property cemeteries. This is Salubria. This is Germanna Highway, Route 3 on the way to Fredericksburg. This is the Salubria house. To the northeast of the house is the cemetery. They did a survey of the cemetery about 15 years ago, and they came up with about 57 burials. I'll talk a little bit about that as well. But this again, Lady Spotswood probably is buried in there, Governor Spotswood's wife. The other place that she possibly could have been buried is the Great Fort Cemetery, but most likely here. So that's an ancient old cemetery in here. Now another relative, you go down a generation down, Reverend Thompson's second wife was a Roots, and they had a few children, and one of those children ended up marrying Burkett, Davenport Burkett, which is just north of town. In fact, Jane's ancestors lived there on that farm, Hilly Farm, and but this is a pretty important cemetery too. There are two old stones here. One of 1790 and the other is 1795. Burkett's wife and his daughter buried there. His daughter had lung cancer, had breast cancer, and it's descriptive about her painful death on the tombstone. And then his wife's buried there. He owned the property. Burkett Davenport was one of the leaders in the Revolutionary War. He served in one of the Revolutionary conventions from Culpeper County. And this is where the farm is. It's just north of town. This is where this little group of trees here is where the cemetery are. These are two images of the stones. But again, Burkett Davenport, this is who he was. His portrait used to hang in the Masons Masonic Lodge, 100 years ago. And he was the father-in-law of Colonel John Jameson. Colonel John Jameson married Burkett Davenport's daughter. So that, and everybody wonders where Burkett Davenport was buried. Well, I'm sure he's buried there. But often if you're the last one in the family to die, you don't get a marker because there's nobody else. And most of his family had died or disappeared. They went out to Kentucky and so, so you're kind of the last one standing, and that often is an unfortunate thing. Now with that, we have the Coleman, which is the Masonic Cemetery Day. The old family cemetery of the Coleman and the Stevens family. General Edward Stevens, that Stevensburg's named after, a lot of fame around here in Culpeper County. This was his cemetery. This right here is Fairview. This is the old house that was built in the 1850s. I'm pretty sure, because it's on the top of the hill, I'm pretty sure that's probably where the Coleman family place was, and then General Stevens kind of took it over. And literally about 100 yards behind the house, this is the Masonic Cemetery. So that was their family cemetery that he donated to the Masons. He was one of the Masonic leaders. And this is it today, the Masonic Cemetery. But it really started out as their local family cemetery. And these are graves that are pre-1800 graves of the Stevens family in that Masonic Cemetery. Very historic. Of course, the Fishback Fleetwood Cemetery, it's up by Jeffersonton. It's very historic. This is what it's got, a rock wall on it indicating a little bit of money. Three different Revolutionary War burials are there in that cemetery. These are two of them. So this one's fortunate that we do have stones for. And then again, there are stones. There's a number of field stones. There are actual monuments. Now, I mentioned the Gaines Cemetery earlier. The Gaines family was a very prominent early Culpeper County family. They were related to the Pendletons, and the Pendletons were a very important family. Edmund Pendleton right here, he was a member of the First Continental Congress from Essex County. He was the brother of Nathaniel Pendleton, who owned Redwood, which is right off of 522. Nathaniel Pendleton led the surge in 1765 in the protest of the Stamp Act. He was the lead justice in Culpeper County. He was the brother of Edmund. Edmund was the speaker of three of the last conventions of the colony/state of Virginia when they adopted their constitution. He was the speaker. Edmund Pendleton was of the proceedings that were going on. And of course, James Pendleton lived in Culpeper County. His son, very involved in the Revolution, as well as his grandson, Henry Pendleton, that was a Culpeper Revolutionary purchase as well. So these three Pendleton brothers. And then you have their sister, Mary Pendleton, married James Gaines. James Gaines was out here. James Gaines also involved in the Revolutionary War. His son was a Culpeper Minuteman. Henry Gaines became a minister. He ends up getting land and going elsewhere. But his son, Reuben Gaines, ended up staying here. And where their property is just on Route 29 where the Three Flags development is. It's right there. We tried to find this cemetery, Wayne and I, and we couldn't. And then we finally located, here's where it is, GPS. We located, and it was buried in woods. I mean, terrible condition. The developer had not done anything with that cemetery for 30 years. It was sad shape. Bought it in the 1990s. Developed the land, but didn't care about this cemetery. And this is what the cemetery used to look like. We found images of the 1960s. There's the cemetery. You can see it's out in the open. This is images from the early 1970s. These are from 1995. You can see growth is starting to come on, and now it's in terrible conditions. It's pretty sad that people would let these things go like this. This is the another very ancient, important cemetery in Culpeper, Yancey Arlington Family Cemetery. We just recently located this. We knew where it was, but it had a little difficult access. And this is off Auburn Road, just northeast of Culpeper. It's Kavanaugh property that was down to the Yancey family. The Yancey family had it in their house, in their family for 6 generations, for almost over 200 years. And this is what it looks like today. These are tombstones. They're just wrapped with vines. And it looks like a jungle in there. It's sad, one of the most historic cemeteries in Culpeper County looks like this. This is what it earlier looked like. This is 2003, it was still open, has a brick concrete wall all around the cemetery with steps going up and steps coming down. There's a newspaper, this is the newspaper account 1937, 90 years ago. It says the cemetery is very well kept. This is another later newspaper article telling about the Yancey family. And this tells about how the Yancey family owned and occupied and built this nice wall. It tells who the owner was that built the nice wall around the cemetery. All of that, but it's kind of cut off the bottom. That's one of the problems we're having with the projection right now. The lower part of the screen isn't showing. But it's pretty sad how some of these old cemeteries are the way they are. I read a historian one time that said, you can always tell about a people and a culture is how they do two things. How they take care of their elderly and how they respect the dead. And obviously there's some people that don't respect their cemeteries, the people that are deceased, as well as others. Now there's many that do. This is a very important African American cemetery. This is the Elkwood Shiloh Baptist Church Cemetery. Very good shape. It's very well kept up. A lot of recent historical markers have gone up. With the aid of Howard Lambert and the Freedom Foundation, it's done a wonderful job of documenting a lot of the African American cemeteries and works throughout the county. But you can see, this is where it is. You go to Elkwood, the second turnoff into Elkwood, just before the railroad tracks. You go back on a lane, and it's right here. It goes back to a corner, but there are 2 United States cavalry troops buried in that cemetery, or excuse me, colored troops buried in that cemetery. One went on to be a Buffalo soldier after the war, and so it was Howard Lambert has identified how they ended back up in Culpeper County and died, but there's a number of World War I and World War II burials in there as well, African American. Another very large African American cemetery that we found is the Richards Barnett Cemetery out in the far eastern side of the county. And this cemetery is full of a lot of fieldstones. There's a fieldstone, there's some, these images are kind of hard to see, they're a little more distant. But a large number of fieldstones in this cemetery. It's quite large. I'd say it's one of the largest African American cemeteries that we've identified in Culpeper County. There has been a couple of African American burials in that post-Civil War. The man that owns it now said that there were some descendants that years ago came out from Washington, D.C. area and wanted to see the cemetery. But there haven't been any visiting the cemetery in a number of years. But this is one that needs to be protected and identified and done what we can do with it. The actual Richards family cemetery is, this is the African American cemetery, and this is the white cemetery in the property. And it's taken care of. It's got stones that appear. There's some field stones here too. There are some depressions, combination of This is a small cemetery, but I'm sure there are many more graves around it that are just lost as far as evidence. This is the old Slaughter Jones Cemetery. It's over between Brandy and Stevensburg. Gabriel Jones, who married one of the Slaughter daughters of Francis Slaughter, very important early family around the Revolutionary War and beyond. But as a result, he died during the war, and he was buried on the Slaughter family burial ground, their cemetery, and his more recent Revolutionary War stone is there. There are other indications that there's burials there with depressions. This, of course, is another very important burial in Culpeper County. This is George Washington's sister, Elizabeth Washington Lewis. She lived in Fredericksburg. After her husband, Fielding Lewis, passed away in the 1780s, she came to live with her daughter, who was also Elizabeth Carter. Her name was Elizabeth Lewis, was her maiden name, Carter. And she married Charles Carter, and they lived just east of 29 on the Old Acker farm. Here's this takes you right onto 666. This is 666, where they are by the high school. And this is where their cemetery is. It's very well kept up. The SAR and the DAR keep it up and do an annual event out there just to make sure it's taken care of. But another old cemetery is Locust Grove. This is Locust Grove. If you've never been down there, it's by Rapidan. It's along the Rapidan River. It's probably the oldest surviving building in Culpeper County. It dates back to the 1730s. And the cemetery, here's where the house is, Locust Grove House, where this is at. If you go straight south into the woods, and Rapidan's right along here, Rapidan River. If you go straight south, you'll find the cemetery there. And of course, it's a rock cemetery around it. Number of depressions. Here are some of the more modern graves of the 19th century that are in it, that exist. And if you look here, this is where this cemetery is. There's the house. There's Willis Ford Road. Over here was where the enslaved labor cemetery is located. And it's over here. I've got it highlighted there with GPS coordinates. There are a number of field stones around. That's a quite large African American cemetery as well. Needs really good surveying done on that because it is pretty large. We found a number of stones in spread out locations, which indicate to us that it's a quite large cemetery. Now again, this is one of the earlier families also that settled into Culpeper County, right on the Rapidan, so it was probably one of the earlier settlements. So this could have burials going clear back into the 1720s or so. The Rosen-von Smith Cemetery, it's a good cemetery because it gives you a good indication of all three levels. You've got a lot of modern stones, you've got some older stones, you've got a lot of foot stones, field stones. This field stone happened to have initials on it. They carved in the field stone, so which is rare because if they did carve in, many of them probably did at one time have initials carved in, but they decayed away over the years. But this one still has AF there on the stone, and this stone has just a large number of depressions. Somerville Cemetery is an example of a cemetery that's quite old but wealthy. You can tell it was a very wealthy family, again out by the Rapidan. Very nice rock fence around it, and very nice heavy-duty stones were engraved in it. Here's the Rapidan River, just kind of give you an idea. Rapidan River wraps around this old summer villa. And then the Brown Cemetery, which is far in the northwest part of Culpeper County. Very old cemetery, again, dates back to the Revolutionary War. Daniel Brown is buried in this cemetery or nearby the grounds. This was old Brown family plantation. They call it the Grange up to the north. And this, you can see the Blue Ridge Mountains in the background. Here's the fence. Pretty well taken care of cemetery. Yates Parish Cemetery. Now the reason I bring this is a fairly old cemetery. It dates back to the early 1800s. But when the Yates family and the Farish family bought this land, they bought it about that time period. Now it had probably had burials on this property for 100 years before they bought it. So their cemetery is very nicely kept up. But if you look at it, behind this cemetery, over here and down into this area, there's a lot of periwinkle and indication that could be an African-American enslaved cemetery that's strung out down there beside, or it could be the previous owners. What often happened, if the first 100 years of ownership, you had owners that buried their dead there, and then when the new owner came in, they kind of buried their dead close by, but the older owners just kind of, their cemetery wasn't taken care of. So this could be a combination of both, where we see a lot of periwinkle and evidence of graves. Could be a combination of African-American cemetery or previous owners where they were buried. Now that brings up a good point. African-American cemeteries can be a ways away from where the other cemeteries were on a plantation or farm, or sometimes they're just at the edge of a typical cemetery. So it's a combination of both things. That kind of wraps up the look at some of the oldest cemeteries, but I've got a couple of things here I want to point out. Cenotaphs. Cenotaphs are markers where they're markers for memorials, but they don't show where, they're not on the actual burial ground. This is the David Jameson stone. It's in the Masonic Cemetery. He was actually buried about a mile north of where the Masonic Cemetery is. I haven't identified exactly where the burial ground, but his wife and some kids would have been buried there. And just strange that in the 1980s and previous, oh, let's just move the markers somewhere, you know, not realizing that the burials are still there, you know, they're still in the ground. That very similar thing happened to another cemetery that markers were in the Masonic Cemetery. There was a gas line, and this is a cemetery west of town about 7-8 miles. A gas line was going through, a major pipeline was going through. It was coming very close to where their family cemetery was. So instead of, you know, leaving the markers there, they went ahead and just moved all the markers so they didn't get damaged. And it appears that the gas line did not go right on the cemetery, it was close. And so they just moved all the markers to the Masonic Cemetery. And then when they sold the property, they subdivided it and sold the property. And one of the persons that knew all about this, still living, she said, well, we didn't want anybody to know that there was the new owners, when we subdivided the property, there was a cemetery in their backyard. And when you contact the owners, we told them about where we found the cemetery. And when we told the owners about it, they were somewhat shocked and said, well, that explains the annual flowers coming up in that area of the property every year. Just a little bit about Virginia statutes. What are legal means for removing and relocating human remains for a cemetery? You have to contact Virginia Department of Historic Resources, and you have to pay for that and for the removal. So it's not something that most individuals do. Someone else now owns the land where my ancestors are buried. What are my rights regarding the cemetery? Basically, Virginia law states that you have a right to access to your family cemetery. The owners have to give you access. Now, they can determine when that access is. They can say, I'm going to be around a week from Friday. You can come in during that time. But they cannot deny you access, either for genealogy purposes or as a family descendant. Reservation of rights, we see that sometimes in here, where the cemetery and access to the cemetery are reserved in deeds. So it's a perpetuity, I can't think of the word. Yeah, perpetual access to the graveyard. So that's in some deeds. And then I don't know if abandoned cemetery on my property, what are my legal rights and obligations? There's not a lot of legal rights. Most people, we would hope, would take care of the cemetery, but they don't have to. But if the cemetery is overgrown and is damaged to the point where stones are starting to fall over and an unsightly measure, that can be taken to court and they can be made to keep up the cemetery. Neighbors can do that. But those are some Virginia statutes, and you can Google this, and this information will come up. How to identify a lost cemetery? Well, what we normally do, and this is Virginia, we look for periwinkle. This is periwinkle. Almost, I don't know, Wayne, probably 90% of the time there's periwinkle in these cemeteries. At least. Periwinkle is something that it's not native. It was brought over from Europe by the going back to colonial times. You can find graves in the 1700s and they've got periwinkle on them. So very early they were bringing periwinkle. Periwinkle does a wonderful thing. It covers the cemetery ground. It's such a ground cover that weeds and stuff like that don't grow up through it. So it's very good to keep all that other junk out. Now, it won't prevent trees from growing up through if there's natural trees there, but it does a very good for a ground cover. This is what it looks like. Also, nice little flowers in the springtime. We look for cedar trees or any other tree groups because that's an indication. If you see a bunch of trees out in the middle of a farm, why are they farming around a bunch of trees? Well, it's a good indication there's an old burial ground there, and it's been farmed around forever and ever. You can see there's a lot of times there's old dead cedar trees in some of these old cemeteries with volunteer cedar trees that have grown up around from that. So those are indications of trying to find a cemetery. Now, ways to actually locate a burial. There are 3 ways that they go to actually locate and find the number of burials in a cemetery. One is the most expensive and probably the most accurate is ground penetrating radar or GPR. That's using a machine like this. It goes over the ground. First of all, they line out the ground so they know where they were covering and when it pops up where they got hit or miss. And basically, it's setting radar down to see how compact the soil is. And if they're going over it, less compact soil means that a grave shaft has probably been there, turned over the soil. So that records that. This is an example of a cemetery that I was familiar with in Prince William County. They thought that there were about 20 to 30 graves here, and they found over 100. But Virginia has been burying people for 300 years almost. So there's a lot more grave sites than what we're assuming. When I see something, I might see 10, and I bet there's at least that number of double that number of burials. This is the Salubria survey. It was done with barometer probing. This is a barometer. It basically they put out a grid and they go through about every 3 feet and measure the resistance of this rod going in the ground, and then it tells you the pressure. And when they hit a burial shaft, there'll be less pressure exerted, so they can kind of map out what a cemetery was. This is much less costly. These machines cost into the thousands. Probably normally $4,000 to $8,000, depending how sophisticated the software is in it. This machine here is about $200. And a lot of people still use this. And then the other is soil stripping. Here's a soil strip. Almost every archaeological dig that I've been around as far as cemeteries, this is what they do. Archaeologists come in, take about 1.5 to 2 inches off the soil, scrape it so it gets like this, and you can just see the shafts. See all these brown spots? They're just all burial shafts. And it makes it really easy to go, oh wow, they just show up, because when people replace the topsoil and the other, it's less compact, but it also is discolored. So those are the 3 best ways of actually finding individual burials. So, Emily last year helped put together a story for us as we started to do this project. We started last year. We've been about 100 cemeteries we visited, and some of the goals of, my email is bishjd1@gmail.com. The bottom part's lost. It also has Wayne's email here. Wayne, would you give out your email address?
Sure, wdwildgrube@gmail.
WD
Have fun spelling my last name, but I'll get it to you if you're interested.
And both of us, if you have a cemetery, but that's one of the things that I quickly want to share here. This is our survey sheet. These are the long-term goals. Document as many cemeteries that are mentioned in secondary sources. Share the information with the planning office. We've been working with the planning office. Share information with the library here. And also, down the road, we plan on sharing information with the Department of Historic Resources in Richmond. We have a survey sheet here that aligns with the Historic Division of Historic Resources in Richmond. do you know of cemeteries near where you live that might help us out? So we can, sometimes we find cemeteries all the time. We often go to a farm and they say, yeah, I know where that cemetery is, but you know what? There's another cemetery on my property. Do you know about it? We don't have a record of it. So that we find from individuals all the time. And also, if any of you would like to help document or help us out with some cemeteries, we can always use more help trying to locate cemeteries. It's a pretty big task, the two of us. I'm going to pull up just one thing, and I hope this will pull up, just to kind of let you know what type of reports that we generate. Now, this is what our basic report is. We tell the cemetery name, we give the location, we GPS the center of a cemetery, so it can be found at any time. We have the current property owner. We do a little survey as far as military burials in the place. We give condition, size, approximate number of burials, different things like that. And then we throw in images. And then if there's any historic information that we have that I find or Wayne finds, we put it in there. So the form is there now. Right now it's not attached to the link, so if you hit the map and you want to see, come to the link. But in the future, we hope that, especially the library, we get connected up here at some point, that you can click on the cemetery where it's at, and it'll bring you up the survey information with what all we have here. Now, and there's some of these don't have much, but some have a lot of surveys. Some of the cemeteries were identified through the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s, and we include the reports on there if they're there. So we try to dump everything into these locations. So that kind of wraps up. Wade and I will stick around. We've got about 10 minutes left, so we'll open this up to questions. And I see questions in the back. Yes.
Hi, I'm Evelyn Madden.
I've met you before.
Yeah,
Thank you for coming.
It's been you answered my question that I had about Salubri. I was going to ask you about the survey, what source was used, so you mentioned the GPR. Well, has any LiDAR been used for any of these?
That's just starting to come about, but LiDAR, we're just starting to maybe use LiDAR a little bit to see if we can see anything. Because LiDAR strips all the vegetation from areas, and it's used, my son is a engineer, civil engineer, and he uses LiDAR all the time. And sometimes LiDAR can see where a cemetery is, and sometimes it doesn't see. It can see old roads where it's built up and things like that. So we're just starting to use it, and I know of some other people that deal with cemeteries that are using LiDAR with some success, trying to find old cemeteries that they just can't find otherwise. So it does have some possibilities, yes.
And my last question is, you mentioned the periwinkle. Have you learned anything else about the vegetation in cemeteries other than the African Americans often use the periwinkle? Were those graves, and then close to trees? Now, a lot of the graves that you showed were out in open spaces marked by fieldstones. Were there trees there at one time? Have those trees?
Yes, there were. Often there were cedar trees that were planted, but you know, Virginia, you let something go for a while and everything starts growing, including any other type. But often we'll see evidence that there were old cedar trees that had died, and volunteer stuff along with other oaks and different other trees have kind of come up. But it appears that, yeah, that there were originally some cedar trees existed along 100 plus years ago into some of these cemeteries. But periwinkle is just wonderful. It really is. As long as they have shade and periwinkle, most of the time weeds and things won't come up very well, as long as you keep a lot of the other natural trees out. Because the shade and the periwinkle go real well together of maintaining easily an ancient cemetery site. But unfortunately, some of the places we go to, cattle graze right over the cemeteries, and the cattle have eaten away the periwinkle, and destroyed it, and it's just sad, some of the situations we find. It's like, why would you treat a cemetery like this, you know? But it happens.
Along those lines, I'm sorry.
That's fine.
Along those lines, do you see field stones kind of shoved to the side?
Yes.
And
You see field stones piled up along the
so
street
you
or
can
something like
kind
that.
of tell there was a cemetery that.
Yeah. And sometimes you can actually see a field stone or two that hasn't been shoved aside. But add to that, Wayne.
You know, I can recall several cemeteries that we've been at, and we've seen some field stones in nice alignment, which would indicate that the graves have been placed very purposely. And then you look at a big old oak tree along the side, and there's 5 or 6 field stones stacked up in that around the oak tree. So unfortunately, I think some landowners really don't realize that there are field stones that are marking a grave, and it's just getting in the way of the plow, so they take them away. But fortunately, though, in most cases, we'll find the field stones which are embedded in the ground sufficiently that, you know, it just wasn't haphazardly placed there.
Yeah, I mean, we see all different conditions. And sometimes it's difficult to actually determine if it's what the cemetery is, whether it's an African American cemetery or a white American cemetery, because they're both field stones, you know. We kind of go through the research that's been done previously, try to identify what the cemetery is. But sometimes it's just very difficult. But our main job, we feel, is to try to identify where the cemeteries are located, just because development is here. You know, I lived up north for a number of years, and man, we lost a lot of cemeteries before they got a handle on things, because development just wiped so many of them out. And if they do know there's a cemetery there are protections to that cemetery. But if they don't, they're not. Any other questions? Yes?
Speaking of development, there has been conversation recently about development in the Stevensburg, Madden, Salubria, that whole area. And I was wondering if your efforts have been utilized in shedding some light on that.
As of right now, I don't think they have been utilized, but I hope in the future that they will be and can be utilized. Because I think that's a very important historic resource that really, you know, halts some development. I know we used it, I was on the historical commission in Prince William County, and I know we used it often there to protect. And a lot of times development, we would say, there's a cemetery here, you have to develop around it. You know, I mean, and what they would do, and we found that there was actually a good thing happening, that they would use the cemetery in a positive, use it for green space around a development and take care of it. And, you know, as part of an HOA, they would have somebody that would actually come in and take care of it as they did the grounds. And they maintained it, and they appreciated it too for green space. So we thought something that was going to be a negative actually turned out to be a positive, and they also were able to put signage up sometimes, pay for it, the developer, historic signage telling a little bit about the cemetery, which aided everybody's knowledge, and it certainly was positive, something that we worried about, but it turned out to be very positive. If they know about it, that's the key. They've got to know where the cemetery is.
Jim, may I add to that?
Go ahead.
Are any of you familiar with the Ball Cemetery here in Culpeper County? Just right across Business 29 near the Lowe's shopping center area. There's a cemetery in the middle of a development which is very well maintained. I don't know who maintains it, but it was put there, or it was kept there by the developers specifically when the development was built. So there are instances that we found here where they protect those types of cemeteries.
It's,
Hi, Bill. You mentioned the Brown Cemetery, and you said that it was northwest of Culpeper.
clear up on the Rappahannock, Culpeper border. It's called LaGrange. And LaGrange is the, if you Google LaGrange, you'll probably find it, Brown and LaGrange. But it's up, yeah, real close to the Rappahannock, Culpeper County border. And it's an old Brown family. The Daniel Brown was one of the early burgesses during the Revolutionary War.
I think I know what you're talking about, because I think I tried to drive up in there one time, and it was either gated or fenced off, and you couldn't drive up in the hills.
Yeah, that could be. It's separated from where the property is. It's across the road where the cemetery actually is.
And the Browns had a big farm up there?
Yeah, it's not under Brown ownership now. It hasn't been for about 100 years, but it was another Brown family had it. And LaGrange, they were building the house in 1825 when Lafayette visited. So I think because Lafayette's visit, they named it LaGrange in honor of his visit to Culpeper in 1825.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
I'll make sure you get it.
Two questions, if I may. The first one, going back to your comment about developers. Is the Culpeper County zoning ordinance robust enough to require developers to maybe do a little bit more work than just, I mean, it's one thing if the cemetery is identified, but, you know, as you've indicated, almost every farm in the county probably has a burial site. If that farm is going to be bought up and converted to a development, is there a zoning ordinance robust enough to require development, maybe the developer to do a little bit more historical research to possibly identify and therefore then preserve and maintain it?
I will turn this question over to Andrew Gutowski because he works with the planning board and planning office. So.
That's a quick question. I can't answer it. I know that we've been trying to share this information with the planning department, so they have it. And I know often developments are required to have DH, the Department of Natural Resources, reports done on it if there's suspected historic resources there. But I'm not sure that there's anything specifically in the concept plan that would require a survey prior.
And I mean, going back to what Jim said, it sometimes the developer can turn that into a positive because now he's got green space, he's got, you know, historical preservation a lot of times. So those are credits.
I was a developer, so I can tell you that.
I mean, I know they don't like it, but
No. It often is good PR.
Yeah.
So we always want good PR, too often usually a bad PR. So it usually, if they know about it and they can be, you know, well informed, it's usually well received.
And if I may go to a second question, unrelated, is anybody doing this valuable kind of work in adjoining counties?
Yes. We recently, there's a Virginia consortium, Cemeteries consortium that just got started up within the past year. That Culpeper, Wayne and I were on the initial phase of that. It includes Fauquier County, Stafford County, Spotsylvania County, Culpeper County, Prince William, Fairfax, Arlington. Consortium. And the different people that are dealing with cemeteries in all those counties, we meet at least about every 3 months via online. We have our meetings so that we communicate even though we're distant. And we talk about common issues that we have and common problems and things like that. But one thing about us, most of those counties have been surveyed for 30, 50 years in some cases, their cemeteries. And they're still finding a cemetery or two a year, you know, even though, because they just pop up. But we're very infancy in the program, is trying to do this, but so we're in a much different place than others are. They're at places of trying to clean up and preserve cemeteries. They already know where most of them are. They've documented most of them. They're in the work of trying to clean up and have groups come in yearly and, you know, clean up and that type of thing. We're not at that stage yet. You know, it'd be nice to get there and have people take responsibility for a cemetery or a group. But the first step in all that is doing what we're doing, is identifying where they all are so they can be found again.
So nobody doing anything in Orange? Orange County?
Orange County, I've not heard from anyone in Orange.
I was going to say, so you're the most rural, I
Yes.
suppose.
And we're the
in
most
this
far
consortium.
down into the Piedmont.
So, and not Madison or Rappahannock that you're aware of?
Now, there is a group kind of started up a number of years ago, but I don't know if they're dormant again in Rappahannock County. But I've not heard, and no, a few people have heard about them doing anything for a few years. It was kind of a husband-wife team that were doing some of that work. But since we've been doing this, I haven't heard anything from Rappahannock.
Jim, I bought some property 12 years ago, and I had a big round field, a big round area in the middle of one of the hay fields on my property. And it was just cluttered, and since then, in the last 12 years, I've cleaned it out, I cut it during the summertime, to keep it clean, and it was a graveyard, or it is a graveyard. I see those markers up there about on the lake where I live, and I'm not familiar with the site, and maybe you've already identified it. Is that something that you can share with us?
Well, this is the site that I want everybody to share,
Oh, okay.
to see. Yeah, if you go to, and the address is up there, you may not be able to see it very good. It's https://, but the main part is mapfling.com, MAPFLING /QTAOPAP. If you put that in, that will bring you to this site, and you can see daily where we've been. Because if we visit a site, it will show up as a star that we've actually confirmed the location. And sometimes we'll have a teardrop, but the site's really 150 yards away from that. You know, we're looking at how the road systems changed. Nobody GPSed anything 50 years ago. So we're doing that, and I'm going to pull up the satellite image, and you can zoom in on this to a particular cemetery. And now this is just a teardrop when we haven't been to this one, and I know it doesn't show, the red doesn't show up real well, but it's in a clump of trees. And you can keep zooming this in so you can see pretty much where this is at. So Bill, your question, if you know where your land is, and go to this map and see if we have it on this map.
Exactly.
And it's mapfling/QTAOPAP. Will bring you to this map. And that's something that you can search by hitting the update, those three little dots. It'll bring you a search window up, like Elkwood's up there now, and you can you can put a site in there, and it will bring you to where Elkwood is. And I'll just poke that in and see Elkwood Cemetery. And you can click on that, and it will bring you to where the cemetery that you're looking for is. Now, Elkwood Cemetery, the African American cemetery, it's where the star is in the middle. That takes you right to the middle of the cemetery property. And so you can find it that way. Now those are guaranteed locations with the stars. The triangles, we've been looking for the cemetery, but we haven't found them. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. We just haven't seen any obvious sign of the cemetery. And the teardrops are ones that we want you to help with. If you want to go visit the cemetery and try to GPS it, we get 2 or 3 cemeteries. We go out a couple of days. It's not a full-time job. And we go out a couple of days a week and try to get 2 or 3 or 4 cemeteries. It's a long process, and some of these cemeteries, believe me, they're buried and they're hard to find. So that's what we're enlisting anybody that might want to help do that with boots on the ground. Wayne, comments?
And I just might add that if you look at our maps and you know of a cemetery that's not on there, we really would appreciate knowing about it, and we
This,
like to come out.
this is
and
not the
verify.
end all. I mean, I was in Prince William County and they did a survey of this 40 years ago. And like I said, they're constantly finding 1 to 5 cemeteries about every year that people find in their backyards that were never on their survey maps. So this is never going to go away, but if we can identify almost all of these, it's going to help all of us down the road.
I just want to, I'm a genealogist, and we use a great website called Billion Graves, or Find a Graves. And it is documenting gravestones and inscriptions on gravestones. And if you're looking for someone, you can put their name in, it'll take you to a gravestone in a cemetery. And also, people are requesting information. So they'll know of a cemetery, and they were asking for people to go look for particular gravestones and document gravestones. So at some point, maybe, you know, that gets meshed in this, but...
It kind of is. We are working with someone in Prince William County that likes putting, we use Find a Grave and Billion's Grave just to try to locate and mesh, and we've gone through all their graves on their website just to add to our list to see if there's anything we're missing.
Yeah.
Both of those sites allow people to put in a grave, a cemetery, if they don't know the name of it. So they put in their family name, which really isn't the cemetery name if it's there. So sometimes you kind of have to look and say, oh yeah, what they're looking for is really this cemetery over here with those family members. But it has been very useful. We're using our website not to get to the individual burial in markers. In fact, as Wayne says, almost all the work we do, there's no names on any markers. They're just field stones and stuff. But we're working with someone that when we do find stones, we take images of them, and if they're not on there, she puts them on Find a Grave and Building Graves for it. Because it is, as Andrew said, it's a remarkable site. I found a lot of my ancestors' graves through there in various states, and it's wonderful to help the whole community out.
And I'll just share that I found the grave of my third great grandfather in Orange County on there, but when I went to the cemetery, the church was defunct and the gravestone had been removed. And the picture was only taken 3 years earlier, so someone had gone through and removed all the stones, but fortunately it had been documented earlier by somebody.
A couple of those old, when I showed you those terrible condition of cemeteries, that grave vines were growing all over them, we found the earlier pictures through Find a Grave, where somebody had submitted that they'd been there 30 years ago, and they put those pictures up there. So that's how we knew the conditions used to look like, through the images they put up there. Yeah.
Do you know if dendrochronology has been used to tell the age of a cemetery or an area where you have the field stones around a clump of trees, where they look at the rings in the trees, and so this area is circa this date. Has anybody used that in the cemetery research?
I've not heard of that in a cemetery per se, just because you need, I've used it, I've been around people used it for buildings, trying to date historic buildings.
Mm-hmm.
When there's large footers or large beams in the building, because it almost requires a significant portion of the tree that they can do a boring and then compare it with other data of trees that were existing in the 16 or 1700s or 1800s in the area. And most cemeteries that I know of don't have any of the evidence like that has survived to be able to do that.
Okay.
But not to say that it might not at some point,
Well, one last question, the Three Flags Cemetery. Obviously, that cemetery is owned by the HOA.
The cemetery, the records on it have that it's still owned by a developer, because they've only developed part of that property. The other part of it is still owned by a developer up in Fairfax County. In Fairfax is the ownership. And we've not contacted them. We went through development, and sometimes when there's a developer, nobody's around, we'll just go on the grounds and search. But we never did contact, but it's an embarrassment having to develop. And when that developer bought that property in the 1990s is exactly when the upkeep of that cemetery ended, which is sad. So if any way of Now, to me, that developer should be nudged to clean up the cemetery.
Well, I was asking, my question was how does one
Yeah.
go about getting something like that started? I know in the past, Boy Scouts have helped here on cemetery restoration projects.
And they're a good source, and they do a good job. That cemetery, yeah, somebody should do some nudging. We've talked about, Wayne and I have talked about that cemetery, especially since it's a developer that owns it, that they should be required to. We couldn't find that cemetery, and we knew where it kind of was, but we had to go to the planning office, and luckily, because when they put the survey map of developing it, they had identified the location of the cemetery. So the planning office really helped us. It wasn't on a GIS map, but it was on their plat, and that helped us find it. Wasn't that's how we found that cemetery, buried in the woods, just covered with stuff. But yeah, that really angers me when I see a developer just let something go like that.
Wouldn't you think the county would have made them do something since it was on their, when they did it and they found the cemetery, that they would have made them do something with it?
Well, what happens often when a development is done, the developer is required to undertake different actions called proffers. And my guess is that the county just wasn't intelligent enough at that time to write into the requirement of the rezoning, you need to maintain the cemetery. That could have been something the county could have asked for. My guess the county just wasn't smart enough to ask about it or educated enough. And so they made it into the legal requirement of the rezoning.
So if there's a piece of property currently or in the future that has a cemetery on it and the county knows it, would the county then make them take care of it?
The planning department, this is why we want to get this information to the planning department, because if the planning department is aware of it, they could require, as a part of the negotiation with the developer, you are required to maintain it and write it into law, basically. But my guess is that's not, because, you know, back then, this wasn't on anyone's radar. I mean, I grew up here, this wasn't on anyone's radar screen.
And it wasn't on anybody's radar screen in most counties.
No.
It wasn't until the 1960s that it started gradually becoming on the radar screen as development started coming out of the Washington, D.C. area and the Virginia Beach area, you know, that type of thing. Development and urban growth started to change things. But
And the culture.
What's that?
And the culture changed. You're not living in the same area that your great-grandmother lived in, and so people move away and they just don't think about their heritage.
Yeah. In Virginia, I just think, I'm a historian, I'm genealogy, do all that stuff to be able to do this, and it's just really sad to see how people treat the dead. I mean, it really is. To me, it's very sad. Like I said, a historian that I used to honor quite a bit said, you can always tell about people in the culture and society, how they treat the elderly in their society, and how they treat those the deceased, how they honor the deceased. And I look at some of these places and I go, oh my goodness, they don't care. When they have cattle rubbing against tombstones and things like that, just put up a little fence, you know? I mean, and you see it all here. I mean, it is not Culpeper, it's Virginia, but it's just sad. It's sad. And then the other side, sometimes we'll go to a cemetery and the family hasn't lived there for 100 years, you know, descendants, but the family owners have taken it upon themselves to keep that cemetery in very good condition. You know, it's both sides.
I'll just share a story. I'm half Polish, half Virginia, half Polish, but in Poland, it's a very different thing. The Poles just unbelievably respect the cemeteries. In fact, the day before Halloween on All Saints' Day is the biggest national holiday in Poland, and the whole country shuts down, and everyone goes to family cemeteries. And they travel across the country to the family cemeteries, restore them, light candles, and it's a day of celebration and mourning, but also of cemetery restoration.
Honoring
It's just one of the most
ancestors.
amazing thing to go to these cemeteries, and at nighttime it's lit up, which is millions of candles, and people visiting the cemeteries and stuff. It's quite warm.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
So when you find these cemeteries, like I noticed you have that one in Locust Grove, Do you do any genealogy on the families that started it, or?
Yeah, I do a little bit. I don't spend days and days, but I look through various sources. I'll look through old newspapers, accounts locally. I've got ancestry accounts, so I look through ancestry just to see. And if I find some, and I'll do a cursory search, and sometimes if it's interesting, I'll continue to dig. But and I drop all that, as I said, on my survey form. I just dump it in there. So anybody wants to, they can go back and visit. But yeah, I do a little bit.
When you do those surveys, do they become a public record when you hand those into the county?
Well, I'm hoping that they will become public record. I know I've talked to Julie here about putting this on the library website at some point where, like I said, if you click on, I'm hoping that we can get to the point where you can click on the cemetery and it will just automatically bring up the historic survey page, you know. And the survey, the planning office, they're more interested, obviously, in the place and the names. I don't think all the information is probably as meaningful to them, but if they could have access to it, they're more interested in the cemetery location, exact location, for protection for the planning office. But all that, I mean, we're doing this. I'll speak for myself and not Wayne. You know, when you're retired, sometimes you want to get away from your wife a little bit. So you I will say this way, because Wayne's lovely bride is sitting right next to me. So, but and that's jokingly. But I've always liked digging in the ground. I got a little bit of archaeology in me too, you know, and finding history. And it's just so sad. You do the research on some of these people that were buried in that cemetery. They were the people that made Culpeper County, you know, and they're just disrespected in so many ways. They would have hoped that their descendants would have been a little better. And but that's kind of what I think. I mean, my feelings as I see some of these. But that's why I just like getting out there and finding, discovering history. I worked, as I said, with the planning office a lot in Prince William, and positively, permanently identifying where a cemetery is fulfilling to me that we've located it, and it has some sense of protection at that point. Any others? Otherwise, we'll wrap things up. Yes?
Well, I'm from Colorado, product of the westward movement. But we always studied the covered wagons going across, and where you died was where you were buried, and then they drove the wagons over your grave. Mm-hmm. So I often wondered what would happen if the developer came in and found a grave like that. Would they do the current forensic studies, or how would they know how old that grave
Well,
is?
by law, they're supposed to identify someone if they find a grave. You know, if they accidentally run into, they're supposed to identify, go through the local office, through the county sheriff's office or whatever, and then they usually followed up through the state level. Then it usually ends up in the Department of Historic Resources lab, and then they will come out with the archaeologists and take care of the grave. They'll dig it out and see how many are there, and that's what should happen. Now, we all know that probably doesn't happen sometimes. They find something, they don't want to be, you know, just continue, and nobody will know about it.
In the Washington Post, a recent article, African American Cemetery in Montgomery County paved over years ago, and now they think it was a parking lot, but now they think there's a cemetery. It was just in the paper this week. So.
Yeah. I have a story on my family's ancestors that they traveled up from the 1600s in Jamestown and all the way up. They ended up in the 1700s in Alexandria. Well, they were a pretty prominent family. They had a tomb and burials, and it was like it had been paved over with cement from the 1930s for the burial ground. They were redoing, developing that parking lot, and they found a grave. And then they actually had to stop everything, and they redid it, and they found 70-some graves. They found a burial tomb. They did archaeology. They found enough bones and segments that they were able to collect DNA. So they were that was in Alexandria. So, but that's something that you do find out it's a site of a movie theater place, but they did exhume the bodies, the remains. They were all reinterred at Pohick Episcopal Cemetery, that type of thing. But there's a lot that we know. We found cemeteries that are under buildings now. Nobody knew where nobody mentioned that they found a grave when they were doing the building.
They found King Richard III in a parking lot.
Yeah, I remember that story. Well, if you have any further questions, we'll be hanging around. There's a couple of sign-up sheets over here that if you, along the side, that if you're interested in helping with the project, put your name and cemetery information with contact information. And then if you're also just have a cemetery that you know about that we may not be aware of, let us know about that too, because we're open to trying to locate all cemeteries we can. Other than that, thank you very much for attending. Thank you.